I rise to speak in support of H.R. 9495, brought forward by Representative Tenney, Kustoff, and Schneider of the Ways and Means Committee, as well as Representative Titus of Nevada. This bill is about stopping the abuse of the tax code by organizations that support terrorism and ensuring that those who are held against their will by foreign governments or terrorists don't suffer further from tax penalties when they return home to America. In the wake of Hamas's brutal attacks in Israel on October 7th, 2023, we've discovered material support for terrorist organizations like Hamas right here in the United States, much of which have been funded by tax-exempt organizations receiving money from American taxpayers. Tax-exempt status must be denied to any entity found to have provided material support to a terrorist organization.
This bill authorizes Donald Trump to recklessly impose a death penalty on any nonprofit in America that happens to be on his enemies list. With this bill, he can destroy the very life of civil society in this country, one group after another, even though the group involved that he targets as a terrorist supporting group has not violated a single law. Even though the group has not been presented with a shred of evidence or the public for doing this, without offering any specific explanation or reason as to why the life is being taken out of this civil society group, and without providing a day in court, a hearing, and without any meaningful right of appeal, no matter how capricious, no matter how unjustified Trump's action may be.
We must starve the aggressors of the resources they need to commit more atrocities. At the same time, Hamas is still holding hostages in Gaza, including American citizens, kidnapped by the terrorist organization on October 7th of last year. We must honor the struggle of these victims. Unfortunately, they are made to suffer unintentionally due to aspects of our tax code. When those who are wrongfully detained around the world, whether by terrorists or by governments, finally return to America, they could be subjected to tax bills, including penalties and interest on taxes that went unpaid during their captivity. H.R. 9495, the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act, is the much-needed solution to both of these problems. Under this legislation, the IRS will be given the tools it needs to ensure that American citizens held hostage or wrongfully detained and their families do not incur penalties for late tax payments while in captivity. American victims and their families already went through a nightmare. Tax penalties just add to the harm. This legislation would also close the IRS loophole that terrorist organizations have exploited for years. It builds on the committee's anti-terror financing efforts by prohibiting organizations from maintaining tax-exempt status if they are found to have provided material support or resources to a terrorist or terrorist-supporting organization within a 3-year period. This issue is devastating. Let me provide 2 examples. One, U.S.-based tax-exempt organizations hired a so-called journalist in Gaza who was a member of Hamas and was literally holding Israelis taken hostage on October 7th in his own home. He was paid using tax-exempt funds. He was paid using tax-exempt funds. That organization is still an operating tax-exempt here in the U.S. today, even though the Ways and Means Committee has called for the revocation of their status. The IRS commissioner has yet to do anything. Another tax-exempt organization based in the U.S. financially sponsored and funded a foreign group that was just designated by Treasury as a sham charity and a funder of terrorism. The IRS, once again, has yet to revoke the sponsor's tax-exempt status. This legislation is needed. It received overwhelming support, bipartisan support, in the Ways and Means Committee. I look forward to seeing H.R. 9495 receive even more bipartisan support here on the House floor today. I reserve the balance of my time.
H.R. 9495 is a repackaged version of legislation that was originally filed months ago with good intentions, including that of some of my Democratic colleagues. With Trump's election, the conditions have changed. The dangers of granting additional power to him are far outweighed by any benefits from this bill. This is the same Trump who vowed to be dictator on day one and has declared the greatest danger our country faces today is the enemy within. This bill is now opposed by a growing number of civil society groups, over 120 groups, the ACLU, the Brennan Center, the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, the Center for American Progress, the American Federation of Teachers, a list that goes on and on, the Freedom of the Press Foundation. This legislation is done in the name of stopping financial support for terrorism. All of us support stopping terrorism. Like everyone here, I've done that, and I have previously voted for this very language, not once but twice, though the last time it came before our committee, I voiced the very same concerns about the lack of due process that I voiced today. Since none of the deficiencies of this bill have been corrected and no amendment is offered today, we must reject it. If he is on a march to make America fascist, we do not need to supply Donald Trump with any additional weapons to accomplish his ill purpose. Our freedoms will not be destroyed in one great blow. No, it will be 1,000 cuts over the term of this administration, undermining our liberties one after another. To those who say that this bill only applies to groups that are supporting terrorism, consider how very expansive that term can be, both at home and abroad. The foreign tyrants that Donald Trump so much admires have imprisoned journalists, academics, and rights activists by claiming that they are supporters of terrorism. State and federal elected officials in this country have called for terrorism investigations or prosecution of major news outlets. Trump himself has criticized and labeled anti-racist activists as terrorists. Some have mischaracterized environmental groups as eco-terrorists. Under this bill, Trump's list of targets would only be limited by his imagination, not any guardrails in the bill. For example, Trump claimed that Democrats, myself included, who didn't clap enough for him in this chamber when he gave his first State of the Union, were traitors, that we were treasonous. He could target organizations that assist refugees for harboring terrorists, Planned Parenthood or a hospital for the alleged terror of abortion, an environmental group mislabeled as an eco-terrorist, a private university that permits too many anti-Trump demonstrations, a disability rights group that is objecting to Trump's interference with the Affordable Care Act, a shelter offering housing to, I yield myself another 2 minutes. A shelter offering housing to LGBTQ youth, a Vietnam Veterans of America group that previously declared Trump's attacks on Gold Star families disgraceful and un-American, think tanks that don't happen to think the way Trump wants it, groups fighting Christian nationalism, or simply any tax-exempt group not viewed as sufficiently pro-MAGA. Now, let's talk about the examples, the two examples that the chairman just referred to. He thinks the IRS commissioner has not acted swiftly enough, and it sounds like perhaps he's right. Well, who do you think appointed the IRS commissioner? His name is Donald J. Trump. The defect is not in the law as it exists today, but on the question of whether or not there has been proper administration of the law that exists today that can deal with terrorism. If the real purpose of this bill as well were simply to postpone tax filing deadlines for the very small number of Americans that have been detained hostage, as wrong as that is, are approving right now the bill that has lingered here as Republicans shelled it for 6 months, that the Senate approved to do that, to provide them that protection. We can put that bill on the president's desk right now. The very fact that the Republicans use this claim of helping hostages, it's a subterfuge, because what it's really about is empowering Trump to do more harm. They are, in essence, holding the hostages hostage once again. I yield back and reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I also stand in opposition to H.R. 9495, which would provide this administration and any future administration with sweeping unilateral authority to designate nonprofits as terror-supporting organizations and strip them of their tax-exempt status with no due process and without sufficient evidence. The authorities provided in this bill are unnecessary and extremely dangerous if they ever fall into the wrong hands. And this legislation would do nothing to improve our ability to combat terrorism because there are already numerous legal mechanisms which effectively monitor and penalize nonprofits that provide support to terrorist organizations. No one in this esteemed body wants any nonprofits to direct even $1 to a terrorist organization, and it's inappropriate to suggest otherwise. And in the hands of responsible government, the powers provided with this bill are redundant and duplicative. However, history is uncertain. Democracies, even ours, can wax and wane. Sometimes we have great presidents, and sometimes we do not. Under the leadership of an unscrupulous or an authoritarian president, it's not hard to imagine how that administration could use the powers in this bill to hinder or dismantle organizations they don't like. Remember, no due process, no right of appeal, no right to see the evidence against them, no path to cure. It's deeply unfortunate this bill was combined with common sense legislation led by my friends Representative Dina Titus, Claudia Tenney, and me that would have allowed the IRS to waive or postpone fines and fees on taxpayers who have been unlawfully detained or held hostage overseas and have not been able to pay their taxes on time. And I was pleased to see that piece of legislation unanimously pass the Senate earlier this year. However, its pairing with these deeply controversial provisions in H.R. 9495 risks those provisions ever becoming law. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose 9495 and hope that we can find a path forward to provide desperately needed relief for Americans who've been wrongfully detained overseas. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds to respond to a question.
Yes, please.
So the bill you have is the same one that the Senate passed 6 months ago. Have you been given any reason why the Republicans, if they're so eager to help the hostages, have held that bill instead of bringing it up for us to consider and getting it on the president's desk right now, this week?
I have never been given that reason, no.
I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman from Texas. Reserved. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really, I cannot understand what is controversial about an organization losing their tax-exempt status if they're funneling terrorism. I don't see how that's controversial, but apparently the prior speakers believe that it's controversial. It's crystal clear. This legislation has passed out of the House with overwhelming support in the past. The Senate's been holding it up. The Democrat-controlled Senate has been holding it up, but guess what? In a couple months, it won't be the Democrat-controlled Senate. Anyhow, I reserve.
I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 9495, the so-called Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act. This legislation would grant the president-elect unilateral power to essentially shut down any tax-exempt organization based on any simple accusations of wrongdoing. Let me repeat, a simple accusation of wrongdoing. By granting the Treasury Secretary enormous power, the Secretary would have the authority to stifle any nonprofit organization that has provided, quote, material support, end quote, to terrorists. Granting this broad authority to investigate and strip nonprofits of their tax-exempt status paves the way for weaponized action against targeted organizations based on their core missions and political beliefs. Now, mind you, I do not support do not support organizations giving material support for terrorists, but I'm concerned about a simple accusation of wrongdoing leading to that happening. To be sure, nonprofits are already prohibited from providing material support to terrorist groups. And this legislation is unnecessary and duplicative, and I support full enforcement of existing law. Under a new President-elect Donald Trump, this proposed law could be punitive. The notion of giving President-elect Trump the power to take away the tax-exempt status of nonprofits associated with his so-called political opponents is staggering. Yet here we are. President-elect Trump, before and during his campaign, made numerous comments regarding his supposed enemies. These so-called enemies include individuals, corporations, or organizations that have been critical of the former president's policies and comments during the past and present. Now let us consider the case of a reputable organization like the Japanese American Citizens League. This nonprofit, tax-exempt charitable organization, 501c3, that has done immeasurable work on behalf of the community and even our nation, advocating for Japanese Americans and other marginalized communities, including arguing against the Muslim ban. As a proud Japanese American myself, I am in awe of the great contributions that this nonprofit has made. Yet, with this legislation before us today, one can predict a scenario in which this group may be targeted for supporting Muslims should a Trump Muslim ban 2.0 come to fruition. Every day in this country, nonprofits are doing incredible work. They touch a range of different policy areas and sectors, and with this bill are at significant risk. As written, this bill risks allowing LGBTQ organizations vulnerable to attacks solely due to their collaboration with human rights groups in hostile areas. Loss of tax exemption would mean that these organizations would be subject to corporate tax rates, increasing financial burdens and likelihood of financial hardship. New tax liabilities would divert funds away from core missions and activities, therefore impeding the work of supporting initiatives and community outreach. We all know well that organizations here that could be implicated are going to be based on political repercussions. A chilling effect of revoking tax-exempt status could deter other organizations from speaking up, essentially curtailing free speech. Current law dictates it is already a federal crime for nonprofits to provide this support for these groups. So why are we here today? Granting the executive branch such extraordinary power based off unilateral accusation paves the way for significant abuse. This bill is a gift to President-elect Trump, wrapped in a bow right before the holidays, to seek vengeance on his so-called political opponents. Organizations such as J Street and the ACLU have come out in strong opposition to this bill for good reasons. The potential change in tax-exempt status would not only impact the financial stability of countless nonprofit organizations, but would severely, additional 30 seconds?
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized for another 30 seconds.
The potential change in tax-exempt status would not only impact the financial stability of countless nonprofit organizations, but would severely undermine their ability to carry out their core missions advocating for civil rights and social justice. Loss of funding and a reduction of capacity to serve communities threatens the survival and effectiveness of these nonprofits. We should be uplifting these organizations and not hindering their success. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll say it once again. It's pretty clear. This bill gives the IRS the authority it needs to revoke tax-exempt status, for organizations that provide material support for terrorism. That's it. So the tax-exempt organizations that aren't providing material support for terrorism, they have nothing to fear.
The ability to demand that no dollars flow from America to any terrorist organization has been long recognized in the law as it exists today. In fact, the chairman has conceded that when he says his complaint is that the IRS has not moved fast enough under existing law. This is not a question of an inadequate law. It is against the law today to provide support to a terrorist organization, be it exempt or non-exempt. The question here is whether we should change the law to eliminate the right to know what's the evidence to that effect. Is it just the chairman's claim that someone is a terrorist organization? If it is a terrorist organization, why not present the evidence? Why not provide an opportunity for a hearing for that evidence to be tested? Why not provide a meaningful right of appeal? No, none of these safeguards are there, and they're there for they're lacking for a reason. The desire is to be able to weaponize the Treasury with regard to these organizations, and to do as has happened under one tyrant after another in another country, to claim that the opponents are terrorists, a term that is expansive. Unchecked authority to revoke the nonprofit status of such groups without cause or due process risk Trump truly weaponizing the Treasury Department and destroying civil society organizations across this country. As David Thompson with the National Conference of Nonprofits has said, by violating basic due process rights, this bill bodes ill without input from the charitable sector. As civil society groups have stated, over 120 of them, the executive branch could use this authority to target its political opponents and use the fear of crippling legal fees, the stigma of designation, and donors fleeing controversy to stifle dissent and chill speech and advocacy. It's not just the denial of tax status, it is the threat of denial. It is the use of intimidation at which our president-elect is an expert. To let this be an intimidation of one group after another, a church, a social organization that has nothing to do with terrorism but can be characterized as such by him, and that's all it takes. If Trump calls you a terrorist, just as he called me a traitor for not clapping long enough for him, that's all it takes under this bill. Then you have no hearing, you have no evidence, you have no true appeal rights. The supposed administrative provisions, administrative safeguards of this bill are a total sham. After you've found guilty and denied your taxpayer status, then you can complain about it. It's based on the principle that you're guilty before proven innocent. The process there provides no protection whatsoever. Again, with regard to helping the hostages, and let's be very clear about that. For 6 months, we have had in this House the opportunity to pass a Senate bill that is word for word a bill that's pending here in the House to help the hostages. Why has that not been done? The very fact that there is such great interest in the hostages today and such total insensitivity over the last 6 months to do anything about them tells you that there's an ulterior motive here, that the goal is not about helping perhaps a dozen hostages, victims, families have gone through hell. It's not about that. It's about placing one civil society group after another on the line under a new president to use unlimited discretion to attack his political foes. We have an opportunity tonight to either advance the cause of fascism or to push back about it, push back against it. And you know, we have statements not from Democrats, but from those who work closest with President Trump raising concern, causing my concern about giving him any additional power. After he called the press the enemy of the people, there is concern about the impact on the press. So many of our journalist organizations now at the local level are nonprofit organizations, and to lose their tax-exempt status is to destroy freedom of the press. But we know with regard to President-elect Trump that his appointee, General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a decorated hero and patriot, referred to Mr. Trump as fascist to the core. That his former chief of staff, the longest-serving chief of staff, one of those best people in the world that he told us he would bring to Washington, said he's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that.
Time as he may consume for the remainder of his time.
How much additional time do I have?
The gentleman has 2¼ minutes.
I do.
Before the gentleman starts, members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personal references towards the president-elect.
So, as
is recognized.
The former chief of staff said, certainly an authoritarian admires people who are dictators, so he certainly falls into the general definition of fascism. Kelly also said that our president-elect has said that Hitler did some good things. Well, I don't want those kind of good things done here in America. I want people that disagree with me as much as the chairman does tonight from across this country to have their opportunity to have their say. I think that a vibrant, diverse civil society and freedom of the press here is vital to the future of American democracy, and I don't want to see it snuffed out by one new figure. Let us not, tonight, give a wannabe tyrant the tool of tyranny, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president-elect, including by making references to other sources that would have been out of order if spoken in the member's own words. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to the prior speaker's comments of the Senate hostage bill that was passed earlier, we had the IRS, we had joint tax that said that there were flaws in how it was drafted. This bill fixes those flaws according to what the IRS said and joint tax. And also, the prior speaker is also a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and they know that according to the Constitution, all revenue measures originate in the House of Representatives. That bill is a revenue measure that originated in the Senate. So that is why we're doing this legislation, in order to get it accomplished, to follow a very important document. It's called the U.S. Constitution. There is something terribly wrong when organizations that support terrorism can abuse the tax code here in the United States. But American citizens victimized by bad actors abroad can be subjected to tax penalties when they return home to America. There is something terribly wrong when a so-called journalist in Gaza who had been hired by a tax-exempt organization in the U.S. holds Israelis taken hostage in his own home for months. There is something wrong when the U.S.-based nonprofit sponsor of a designated sham charity and funder of terrorism still has not had its tax-exempt status revoked. And there is something terribly wrong when families have already gone through a nightmare just to face tax penalties when they get home. H.R. 9495 is the answer. It received overwhelming bipartisan support in the Ways and Means Committee. I look forward to even more bipartisan support here on the House floor today. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 9495 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair...
Mr. Speaker, excuse me.
In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for the yeas and nays, and pending that would raise a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Yeas and nays are requested, and those...
I want to vote.
Is the gentleman demanding the yeas and nays, or is he making a point of no quorum?
I am.
Demanding the yeas and nays.
I raise a point of order that a quorum is not present, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.